So I wanted to make that little announcement. And the last I want to make announcement is the conference. For those who would like to go to it, again, it's in March. I need to know as soon as possible so I can help make the room reservations. And, well, it'd be lovely to get a bus. Just bring everybody up in a big bus and have a great party weekend and you know, be with God's people and fellowship. But I know that's not possible yet, but maybe one day it will be, you know, to do that. So anybody who would like to go, we're expecting a very good turnout this year. I'm getting calls from people all over, new people. Actually, I met with two leaders, minister and a deacon up in Kansas City a few weeks ago. He invited me up and wanted to discuss a few things about the church. And we spent Friday night from about 6:30 or 7 to almost midnight. And then Saturday night, we met from about 7 to about 1 in the morning and going over things and discussing the work that God's been blessing us with. They were very impressed, and they've made their reservations. They'll be at the conference. And so I asked people, just please come as a visitor. I said, I'd like for you to see firsthand how we operate as a team, that we're all unified. And I like people to come together, and I don't want to be able to just tell you about the work of God. I want you to see it and feel it, because there's a spirit of camaraderie and unity in the church and its leadership that has not been there for a long, long time. And I promise you, because I believe God's with us, unless we do something wrong, you will walk away from that inspired. It was an inspiration last year, and I believe it will be again this year. Because there's a lot more information I haven't shared with everybody yet of the blessings that God's been opening for us as we go forward. And some of that I want to save for the conference, you know, as we go. Anyway, that's all I basically have for announcements. We do have potluck. Oh, there is one more announcement for you all here locally, is that we have part 2 of the Joshua series. It will be in the back with the Bible study lessons, the answer sheet, and the DVD. Please take one. If you know someone who you share them with, I know some of you share with people in other organizations, please take them and share them. And, you know, hopefully God will bless us with that. That reminds me that we've got a call a few weeks ago from the Journal newspaper, the Journal of the Churches of God. And he called me up one evening and wanted to take an interview, said he went over the Bible studies that we've been doing, and they were very impressed. And he took an interview from me, and he gave us 2 columns on the front page of their next issue that'll be coming out for the Bible study sermon series. And we believe that's going to help expand our work to those who are already in the churches of God. And the powerful thing about that, it didn't cost us anything. It's just that God opened another door for us there. So we're hoping that God will continue to bring forth new helpers in the work and supporters to be able to get things going. Anything else I forgot? Part 3 will come out in a couple weeks too of Joshua, by the way. So part 3 in just a couple more weeks. A few weeks ago, when I was up in Kansas City, I had to drive down to the Springfield congregation, which they meet about 30 miles north of Springfield now. They had lost the room where they were meeting at. They were remodeling, and they decided to do away with the conference center. So then they had to look around, and the rate they were paying was only like $30 a week. They've been there for 8 or 9 years. And so when they began to look around, the best rate they could get was about $100 a week. And that was just a little more expensive than a smaller group they wanted to pay. So they moved 30 miles north of there, which made it a little more convenient for many of their members. And they were able to get the rate down to about $50 a week, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, I was driving down there. And on Friday night, I'm trying to work on a sermon. And I came across a phrase I mentioned to you. In fact, I did a sermon here just a couple weeks ago on "This generation shall not pass." Well, I didn't have a lot of time to put the sermon together because it was Friday night. We met like at midnight, and I had to get up at 6 and get ready to drive down several hours to be able to meet with the group, and I want to give myself enough time. So I stayed up a little late, and I put some thoughts together, and God inspired some thoughts in me. And as the next morning was going, I had the directions in my pocket, and I briefly went over the directions, went down to the little breakfast nook and got a croissant or whatever it was and threw it in the microwave real quick, or the toaster. That's what I threw it in the toaster, and I'm trying to eat on the way while I'm putting my sermon together in my head. And I got the directions in my pocket. Now you can imagine this, and it was raining, it was kind of cool and chilly, and it had a little fog going around, and I got these directions, and I go through them and say, okay, I got it, I know where I'm going, put them in my pocket and start going. Well, I'm driving down the road, and I'm having just a great time. The sun comes out. I'm out in the country along the interstate, and I'm not paying a bit of attention. And I knew I had to go about 172 miles, and just before that, there was going to be a turn off of a road to get to where I'm going to go. Well, when I did that, I didn't pay attention to one of the instructions, and the turnoff was way back. And so I had gone, when I looked at my speedometer, I'm saying, well, I should be about close by now. Well, I done went 10 miles further than I'm supposed to go, and I don't have a clue where I'm at. I've never done this before. I had been so focused in what God was showing me that I became completely oblivious to where I was at. And I was working on that sermon, and in the sermon I delivered, because when you find something new, or you find things when God begins putting together in your life, don't you feel inspired? Now, everybody in God's church has gone through that. If you've come into God's church and you've been considering baptism, God has opened your mind and you saw something. And there's been times in your life that you've been in deep meditation and you forget your surroundings in your room. You come out of the thought and then you focus again where you're at. We've all gone through that. God will give you some information, and sometimes it's chilling. Sometimes you get chills and you go through these thoughts. Well, that's the way I was going down this highway. Well, my cell phone rings, and it's Maynard Sammons, minister out of Florida. And he said, hey, Tom, where are you? And I just realized I had no idea where I was. Now, I'm up in Kansas City, going down to Springfield. When I finally realized where I was at, I was 8 miles away from Oklahoma. 8 miles away from Oklahoma. Now, I only gave myself an hour extra just to be safe. And then, of course, they were having potluck. So once I found out where I was at, I called my wife. I said, listen, you need to help me. I'm lost out here in the middle of nowhere because there's no cities around. And everything that I'm looking at is not even on the map I've got. So I done drove off the map where I was. So she goes on the interstate, on the internet, finds out where I need to go, gets the hotel, gives me a phone number, and I call the place and said, look, I'm not going to make it. So I told Manus, I said, I think I got a good sermon. It's a shame no one's ever going to hear it. And he put me back on track. And so they had potluck first, and I got there a little over an hour late, and it did work out. But I was so inspired with the sermon, I delivered the sermon with impact, with zeal, and with emotion. Raising my voice, driving a message home about this generation shall not pass. Now, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to remind everybody in the messages that the message has to be in such and such a way. And if it's an inspiring message, it needs to be delivered with impact. Well, I've got a Bible study. I don't know if you can see it well here. I'm going to pass it around afterwards. This is the cover that we're going to be putting out with the sermon I delivered here just 2 weeks ago with the slide presentation. It says, this generation shall not pass. Now that we have a color printer and we can print our own materials, it's almost unlimited what we are able to do. So when I looked at the message, I said, I need a message that's going to drive the point home. When people see this, it's going to impact them. So you got a picture of the atomic bomb going off. And the passage says, and he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, and there's a smoke of a great furnace. All right, that's what we're looking at. And you remember when I mentioned Truman said, we may have discovered what the Bible spoke about when he saw this. It says, and the sun and the air were darkened by the reason of the smoke of the pit. And so I delivered with that impact because I said the world needs to understand what we're going through and what they're going to face. Well, when it was all finished, the people there felt moved. I felt the message was successful. Might be a little over successful too as far as the impact, because I raised my voice a few times almost in shouting for warning the world. But that's how I felt that day. I was so impacted by what I saw and the scriptures coming together and saying, we're there. Prophecy is being fulfilled. The generation is passing. World War II generation, the time when it was possible. I said, it's moving along. The people need to be warned, and I felt that zeal. It was a little different than the message I delivered here. It was more of an instructional message here, which was a different format and different layout. One of the ladies came to me after the sermon, quite moved, and said, how do I become ready? Stopped me in my tracks. stopped me in my tracks. And I thought about it for a second. We're busy focusing upon being ready. We're busy focusing on what we need to prepare for. How do you deliver a sermon on how do I become ready? Now, I thought about it, and I had to tell her. I could have gave her all kinds of answers, and I felt they were not justifiable. In other words, I could say, how to? Well, you need to pray, you need to meditate, you need to study. Boom, 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 you're done. Now, I've heard sermons like that. I went back in my recollection of the last 20, 30 years in the church, and these how-to never did it for me. Did they ever do them for you? Maybe they did. And you go through a process of learning about God. You got step 1, step 2, step 3. Now, I don't know how it is for you, but I'm not that kind of person. I'm not a step 1, 2, 3 person. I've got to get into and feel and see. I got to understand. I got to wrap my mind around it, and it's got to become a part of me for it to work. 1, 2, 3 just don't do it. I heard sermons going to get me ready if I get on my knees 30 minutes a day. Another guy said you get on your knees an hour a day. Another sermon said I got to pray an hour, I got to fast an hour, or fast or whatever it was, and then I got to meditate an hour. And I looked at all the time I got to put in. Then I had an 8-hour day at work. Then you got to travel back and forth to work, and then you got a family. So there just ain't enough hours in a day to do that. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get to where I'm around somebody who's with me because they got to be, don't you feel uncomfortable with that? If I go to God and I say, okay, God, time me, I'm ready. Start. There goes my 60 minutes. Okay, I'm ready. And then you sit there like, well, I don't know what to say now. I don't know how that affects God. You're not there because you want to be there. You're there because you told yourself, I got to be here. I'm putting my time in. Have you been through that? Another problem I found when you went back to that type of message, you know what's always at the bottom? Prayer. You ever notice that? It's always at the bottom of your list, prayer. It seems to me it ought at least be at the top. You know, if it ain't at the top, how about second? You know, it's got to be up there at least to be second. So I struggle with this sermon on how. How does a person come to the point to help another person to be ready? Now pay attention to this. To be ready for something we have never seen before. Now think about that. Isn't that what we're moving into? We're moving into a time that Jesus Christ said there will never has ever been a time like it and never will be again. The job of the church is to help prepare this world, to get it ready for when the return of Jesus Christ comes, for something we have never witnessed. How do you do that? Well, step 1, step 2, step 3. That'll do it. It won't do it when you see your family suffering. It won't do it when you see family members being taken away captive. And when someone comes into your home and begins to ravish the women, when people are starving to death. Well, remember step 4. Don't forget step 4. It just don't cut it, does it? And so when the lady came to me, she said, Tom, it's chilling what we have to go through. And she said, you bring these points home and they're real to me. How do I get ready? And I had to tell her the truth. I don't know yet how to tell you how. And so what I want to do today, I want to make a stab at how to become ready. Because you see, it's the most important thing that's on our plate as Christians. If we can't prepare ourselves to be ready, we're not going to make it. It's that simple. I remember all of you here live in the Katrina zone. Everyone here, or have lived here, moved away. But you were in the hurricane-ravaged area, and most of you have been here all your life. If someone told me the day before what it would be like, I would explain Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. This is what's going to happen. The hurricane's going to come in. We pack up. We get our water. We get our batteries. Those who've got enough money, you get your generator, you get your gas, and you drive off. The hurricane comes through. A day or two later, you go back. You spend 2 or 3 weeks without electricity. You fix up whatever damage there is. You fix a little bit of roof, and you're set, and you get ready for next year. Well, that's the way it's been in the past. All the hurricanes I've been through, actually, I've been through hurricanes where I could look up and I've seen the sun. I've been through them. I wasn't ready for what happened. I wasn't ready to look at bodies floating in the water. I wasn't ready for a newsman standing on the interstate, focusing on the city and all this water, and have the camera pinned down to a body laying on the sidewalk of this interstate, covered up because they didn't have enough time to pick them up yet because there's so many people still stranded. I wasn't ready for that. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't prepared. I thought I was prepared when it talked about the people in the city and violence is going to increase because food is going to be shorted. I thought I was prepared for that, but I wasn't. I wasn't prepared for any of that, although I've seen it in the past to some degree. I heard it from the news. I lived through it in the past, but I was never ready for what never happened before. Now, back into what Jesus Christ says, that we have to be ready for something that we have never witnessed before. We have to find a way to focus inside of ourselves, to put our minds around, to be wrapped into what's coming. And then I realized as I went through this, I was asking the wrong question again. See, to focus on how to get ready is the wrong way to do it. Do you realize that? Well, that sounds kind of far-fetched. You can't get ready for that. That is the outpouring or the result of something else you have to do. Now, let me back that up because I know I'm not playing with your heads here. Being prepared for what's about to come is the result of doing something else. Because you see, you don't really prepare for that. You can't prepare for that in the same way that you do like you would for a hurricane. There's something else that must be done first. When God showed the prophets what was coming, they shook to their bones. Fear overtook them. Many of them said there was no strength left in me. They couldn't describe what they saw, but utter fear just overpowered them. They were speechless. Their mouth would dry up. Their bones would shake. They'd fall to their knees. That's what's coming. Those things are yet to be understood, and we just can't picture them yet. We try to. We can look at what's going on in the third world countries and what's taking place over there, but it's just like the news media who comes here. When the news media comes to New Orleans and they begin to take pictures of all the ravaged areas, everyone I ever heard, everyone said the same thing. I seen it, but I just never imagined it until I saw it firsthand. That's what the prophets saw. And that's why they shook and their bones rattled, their knees collapsed, and there was no strength in them. Our job is to prepare the world for that. If we don't prepare inside, we will never be ready to prepare them. And you just don't prepare for what you can't imagine to happen. I couldn't imagine within 3 days the people and the hordes of people would come out of the city and begin going into homes and businesses and begin burning and looting and murdering for food within 3 days. I couldn't imagine that. And yet I saw it. I couldn't imagine what took place inside the Superdome at the convention center. But yet it was real. And you multiply that on a scale that's unimaginable around the world, and you begin to get a grasp of what we're up against. Now, I won't tell you that this sermon will accomplish my entire task, because I don't think it will. But there is one thing that I want to bring out that this sermon is going to be about, and how we focus to begin to make those needed changes of how do we change? How do we focus? I wanted to call the sermon "How To for Dummies." Everything out there's got a how-to for dummies. Fixing a roof. How-to for dummies. They got that out there. It's internet for dummies. I said, but I thought about religion. Somebody's going to take it real personal. He said, "You calling me a dummy?" No. So I said, well, that's not a good idea for a title. It's really not a good idea for how to. Now, Danny has a sermon he wants to give, and somewhere in the future, and he wants to call it "Stupid People." Stupid humans. Well, that's not a good title either, because somebody's going to take it personal. Especially when you get off the pulpit and somebody says, "You talking about me?" Well, kind of in a way, sort of. This is the way Danny talks. I don't even have a title yet today. Maybe you can help me develop a title. But as I go through, I have one goal. And the goal needs to focus on how do we be ready? How can we be ready for what's coming? Now, let's look at some scriptures here. Go to the book of Philippians, chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. I started off going through this by looking at some end results. Certainly people have been through a lot through the past 6,000 years. I wanted to go through and see how they dealt with an accomplished goal of being ready. Now look what Paul says in the book of Philippians, chapter 4, verse 11. It says, "Not that I speak in respect of want." Now Paul is, let me go back a couple of scriptures here, a couple of verses, to verse 10. It says, "But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at your last care of me has flourished again, in which you are also mindful, but you lack the opportunity." Now he's telling them, I appreciate what you have done, and I know you would have done more had you had opportunity. This is the relationship Paul had with Philippians. But look at the comment that he makes. He says, "Not that I speak in respect of want." He says, look, I'm telling you this not because I need anything from you, nor do I want anything from you. It says, "For I have learned that whatever state I am in this, to be content." Right? Now that's a finished product. No matter what happened to him, he was content. Now here's a man who went through great trials in his life. He'd been beaten. He'd been stoned. He'd been left for dead. In fact, when God called him, God told him, Saul, "I'm going to show you great things that you will suffer for my name's sake." From the very beginning. Imagine if you and I, in our beginning calling, somebody sat down with you instead of counseling you for baptism. They're counseling you, said, "Now listen, when you go through this for baptism, this is what you're going to have to overcome. You're going to be dragged out and you're going to be beaten. Some of your friends are going to turn against you and try to put you in jail. Some of those in your own family in the church are going to turn their back on you and accuse you of many things. So others are going to try to kill you." How would you feel? When God talked to Saul, who became Paul, he says, "I'm going to tell you great things that you're going to have to suffer for my name's sake." When Paul said, "Yes, Lord," it took him 3 days to go through this and evaluate what he was going to have to deal with. And he had to make a decision upon that. Now, from that man, from the beginning, to this statement, God is merciful to us, because we would look at this, if we left it as intact, and say, well, this is a great man, and of course he is, don't get me wrong. We would think that he went through his life and he never struggled. He made his commitment at the beginning, just like you and I. He grows to the point, now he's in Rome when he writes this, and he says, "I am herewith to be content." God is so merciful to us, he lets us see the shortcomings of other individuals. Now go back to Romans 7. Same individual. Book of Romans, chapter 7. When people are struggling to overcome things in their life and they want to give up, I will normally tell them, I want you to go back to the book of Romans and read chapters 6, 7, and 8. And the reason is that Paul lays out what sin is about and how sin can overcome and how sin can destroy. chapter 7 is about that individual, Paul. This was written about 23 years after Paul was converted, chapter 7 of this book, showing how God was merciful to us, to show how Paul was still struggling to overcome the desires in his own life. Now, I want to pick it up in chapter 7. In fact, if you go to chapter 8, I'm not going to go there, but chapter 8 would conclude how he has basically overcome those. So what we're looking at is we see the life of sin, how Paul's aware of sin in chapter 7, how he struggles inside himself to overcome those sins. And then chapter 8 shows the person who's walking a more spiritual life. And that's why I tell people to read those 3 chapters, because it gives you a little more insight of human nature and how things go. Now, I want to pick it up in chapter 7, verse 14. It says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin." So now we have Paul revealing something inside of him to the Romans. Verse 15 says, "For that which I do, I understand not." It's amazing. He says, "That which I do, I understand not. For what I would, that do I not, but that which I hate, that I do." Now here's a man saying, look, I really don't understand why I'm doing this. Have you reached the point somebody comes to you and says, "Why did you do that?" Kids are good at this. Grown-ups try to hide it and they want to make excuses, but the fact of the matter is quite often we say, "I don't know." Well, it's the lust of our flesh pulls us back to do things we shouldn't be doing. It's that simple. And we have to break that carnal way. So Paul's saying that I don't understand why I'm doing it, but I know one thing he's saying. What I want to do, I don't seem to do. But what I don't want to do, I seem to be doing. You know, husbands and wives face that all the time. "Why did you do that?" You know, and they say, "Well, I don't know." And then don't ever use this phrase, "How could you be that stupid?" That never works. It never works. I made that mistake once. Only once. So Paul goes on to say, "If then that I do which I would not, I consent that the law is good." No, he's making himself aware that what's going on. "Now then it is no more that I do it, but sin that dwells in me." Now when I read this, Flip Wilson comes to mind. You know, remember Flip Wilson, Josephine, and he says, "Why did you do that?" He said, "The devil made me do it. You know, I wish I could do like he did it." He wanted to blame it on someone else. But Paul's admitting the struggles inside himself of the two natures. That is the sin side inside of him that's doing this that he doesn't want to do. This is the same man that we just read. That whatever state I'm in, I am therewith to be content. Paul had to learn and he had to struggle to overcome the human nature inside of him to be ready. Now, he had to come to something else too. Now, I want to go on, let's see, let's go to actually verse 15 while I'm here. No, I was going to read the 15 to 25, but I'll let you read that when you go home, because it's pretty much reiterating what I just told you already. He says it in a little different terms and different words, but it bring out the same thing. In verse 25, he says, "I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with my mind I serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin." And we do that, don't we do that? And I was talking about overcoming. And so I was kidding with somebody the other day. I said, I'm going to get up there and I want to give a sermon on obesity. And they laughed. And I said, "You never heard me give one, have you?" And they busted out laughing. I said, because I'd have to get up there. We're wearing a shirt that's 2 sizes too small, and a coat that's about a size and a half too small. And then I would be the person up here who hasn't overcome his weight problem yet, who's working on it, because the law of the flesh tells me you need to eat. Well, I don't need to eat as much as I do, but I have to work on it. And I know that. It's just like a person getting up here and giving a law on alcoholism, and he gets up and he's drunk trying to deliver the sermon. Well, first of all, he shouldn't be up here drinking, period, but you get my point. And so Paul's trying to show us that each one of us have to overcome ourselves. Now let's go to Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and I'm going to begin reading in verse 7. Now this is where Paul is talking to the Corinthians about all the visions and all the things that God had showed him. God had given him insight that at that time basically no other man on the face of the earth had. He even says, I was caught up into the heavens. He said whether it was real or whether it was in a vision, he didn't know. But it was so real to him, he couldn't discern the difference, whether it was real or not. That's the point you and I are going to have to come to with God's holy word at the end time, if we're alive before the return of Jesus Christ. We're going to have it so implanted in our mind. And that's why I push so hard for our visual sermons. Because you see, this word has got to come alive. It's got to be where a person sits and he sees the sermon. Not hears it. You see what I'm saying? Sees the sermon. That means when you see things. How many times have you said, I will never get out of my mind? You saw something that was so impacting, it never leaves you. God's holy word has to be that. I think we are in the generation, in the age where that time is available to you and I believe God has given us that responsibility and the ability to deliver His word in that manner, so that when a person sees God's word, it lives within them and it never leaves them. When Paul had this vision, he couldn't tell if it was a vision or it was real because it was so real to him. The work we have is going to grow to that impact in people's lives. So it doesn't leave them. The Word of God will stay with them through thick and thin. Now, that's not the way to get there. That's only a method to get there. Because, you see, we haven't answered the question yet. Why? Huh? I'm giving you all this background because I want to get to the why. The why is so simple. All right, now, let's go on down to verse 7. God gave him a buffet. He says... let me pick it up in verse 6. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool, for I will say the truth. But now I forbear, lest any man should think me above that which sees me, or that hears of me, and lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelations. Paul was aware that God had used him to reveal certain things that no other man was able to reveal. Paul leaves us information about the Old Testament that's nowhere else recorded, that had to be given to him from Jesus Christ himself. Paul had these revelations and revealing, and then God had to keep him humble, so he gives him a thorn in his flesh so that God could use him. So quite often you'll find that God's leadership, although they seem to have talent in certain areas, in other areas they're absolutely floundering in their lives. It's almost like it's a thorn in the flesh. And you'll find that in people's lives, where they're certain talent in one way and totally inept in others. You know, my spelling is totally inept. You know, I mean, I go through things, and I was sharing this Bible study with Mr. Delaney earlier, and then he's just going through it. I didn't know he was. I just wanted to show the cover. That's all I was here for, to show the cover. And first, the next thing I know, he's asking for a pen. I said, "Oh, he's going to proof it." Sure enough, there he goes. Scratch that out. So that's not my talent. You know, all this grammar and proper English. I said, if you want good grammar, you don't live in New Orleans. Remember Governor Edwards used to have a phrase. He said, you want good grammar or good government? Because he spoke like a Boogaloo, the French Cajun down here. And so Paul goes on to say, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of my revelation, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Paul was saying that certain things had to come to pass. He went through certain persecution to bring him to a point that he could make that statement, therewith to be content. Now, he could not have made that statement when he wrote to the Romans, chapter 7. He was struggling to overcome what he could not control. You see a man maturing, and he was maturing through what he suffered. He had to overcome things, and God will do the same thing with you and I, whether you realize it or not. God will place out there choices. You have to make the choice which is most important to you. Sometimes you're going to do like Paul in chapter 7. You're going to do the wrong thing. Fortunately, that you're around God's people enough that you won't stay away You will take your beating, so to speak, your correction from your brother out of a loving manner, not of a self-righteous manner, and say, I appreciate that you care enough to tell me. That's important. Now, let's go to Hebrews 5 to reinforce what Paul was telling us here in the book of Hebrews, chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. And I'm going to pick it up in verse 8. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8. Though he were a son, now we're talking about Jesus Christ. Though he were a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. We're talking about Jesus Christ. Learning obedience, an individual who never sinned, never committed one sin a day in his life, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. Why would we think our lives would be any different? Paul learned through what he suffered. In fact, you see that Paul says that when I am my weakest, that's when I am my strength. When we can reach the point in our lives that your life is not more valuable than your goal, you begin to reach how? Let me repeat that. When you reach the point that your life is not as valuable as your goal, you begin to reach the point of how. Now, that doesn't tell us how yet. It's only pointing to the direction. Now, notice I wasn't saying step 1, step 2, step 3. What we're reaching for now is reaching inside your heart, inside your soul, the spirit that's in you, to help overcome everything around you. If you can't get to the core, you won't get to the solution. He goes on to say, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, and I've given a sermon before, that means being complete. That's all it means. He became complete. He became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called of God a high priest in Melchizedek, the order of Melchizedek. What do these two men have in common? I just gave you two different examples of two different individuals, Jesus Christ and Paul. They had one thing in common: their life was no longer important to them. You realize how few problems we would have in this age, in this church, if we realize it isn't about me? You realize that? It's that simple. You wouldn't have to defend yourself anymore. You wouldn't have to stand up to make points about what you're doing at all. The whole point is that the point would be God and Jesus Christ. Now, we hate to use those terms, it's all Jesus Christ, because it sounds so Protestantism. But the point is, that's the truth. The work of God is not about us, but it is about us. But it's not about us individually. In other words, the work of God is not me worried about me. It's helping me to help focus them, the people, God's people, on Jesus Christ. If you can get yourself off of you, you don't have a lot of problems to deal with. The Apostle Paul reached that state and realized that it isn't about what's going on. It isn't about me. It isn't about what I'm going through. No matter what I do, he reached the point that he could tell you it's about God Almighty. He said, I wished that I could sacrifice my own life to help Israel, because he loved his nation so much. If we could get to the point where we love God's people that much, your own problems become a lot less. Now, there's something else that's very common between these two, between Jesus Christ and Paul, and the two examples I gave you. Both of them recognized it required obedience. Obedience. We live in a world that tells us you don't have to obey God's law. They're done away with. Jesus Christ, the author of our salvation, the Son of God, sitting on the right hand of the throne of God Almighty today, said he learned by what he suffered, he learned obedience. Isn't that amazing? He learned it. Why would we think we are any different? and to both learn by what they suffered. God's going to move you out of your comfort zone. See, you can't be in that comfort zone and do the work of God. Now, let's pick up another point on what we're going to accomplish to why. Luke 22, the book of Luke, chapter 22. Verse 39, it says, "And he came out and he went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and also followed him. And when he was at the palace, he said unto them, Pray that you enter not into temptation. And as he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, he knelt down and he prayed, saying, Father, if you will be willing, remove this cup from me." Now, what did Paul show us in Romans 7? He showed the human carnal nature of the struggle to overcome, of doing things he didn't want to do. Here we see another person struggling with the same type of environment. His human nature is pulling one way, and his reality is pulling another. The only difference is Jesus Christ didn't give in to his temptations. See, he made the right decision every time. There was no difference. But what we're looking at is the Son of God reaching inside of himself, keeping his mind on the Father, his goal, his commission in life. You and I, if we're going to answer the why question, must look inside of ourselves that God Almighty and Jesus Christ is so real that when we ask the questions, our goal of the love of the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ will overpower the human nature of the struggles to hide. When Jesus Christ was brought to that point of temptation, he never made the mistake. When the soldiers came and they drug him away to be crucified, every one of the disciples had to make the same choice. They all fled and they all ran. They all failed miserably at the last, right before he was taken. But it was prophesied that it would happen. And they learned from those mistakes. Every one of us in this room, every person in this room has failed at something at some point. Now, we joke about that sometimes. The person says, I remember I did that one time. It's been a long time ago since I made the mistake of it. The fact is, we make mistakes all the time. We must get back to the point of our focus upon God Almighty. The common points that need to be done here is both Paul and Jesus Christ knew their relationship with the Father. If we're going to go through the tribulation, we need to reach the point that your relationship with your Creator is real to you. It's not just something you do. It's not something that you sit down every day and say, okay, Father, here I come. Point one, start the clock. Let me know when 60 minutes is up. When that's finished, I'm going to meditate for another 60 minutes. I tried that. I don't know about you, but I tried doing that. And you know what happened to me? I fall asleep. You fall asleep? I'm sitting head shaking. I did try that. I tried it one time. And I was still about 20 years old, and I was trying to put my hours in. And I'm on the side of the bed, I'm kneeling down, and I'm sleeping on the bed. And I don't know how long I was there. My dad come tap me on the shoulder. He said, I think you got this all wrong. Yeah. He told me that quite often about a lot of things. You got this all wrong. But I know I tried. But you know what I missed? I missed the point of why I was doing it. Have you ever been around somebody that you just couldn't wait to spend time with? Anybody married here? Have anybody dating here? Or if you're married and dating, you're in trouble. Unless you're dating your wife or husband. Yeah, I'm doing both of that. Yeah, that's the guy going through the divorce, you know. You couldn't wait to be around that person, you know. How about if you've been away from your family for a while, you want to come home and get near your kids, you know, or near a family member. You know, people who date, and I'll use that example because it's the best thing I can say, is like they just can't stand to be away from each other. You know, then they get married and can't stand to be together. But while they're dating, It's like they spend all this time together, and they get home, couldn't have been 30 minutes, and they call each other, "What you doing?" And they'll sit on the phone, not say a word. They don't fall asleep, but they're so excited to be there. Now, that's the relationship I think the Father wants with us in Jesus Christ. Now, how do you feel when a person comes on and says, "Look, I'm going to give you a call when you get home, and I'm going to put my 60 minutes in." And then it's like, you know the person don't want to be around you. We know when people don't want to be around us. It's obvious. You know, you can feel that struggle and that tension. The relationship with God has to be real, and it has to be first. If your love overpowers your pain, you will make the decision to the love every time. It won't matter what you go through. You quit asking the questions, "Why am I going through this? I wish this would get over real soon. You know, I can't believe God's let me go through this." Then you start blaming God for it all, and you don't even realize you're doing it. Now, I want to go to, let me read verse 44. See, I got all these scriptures, but it seems like they take too much time up. I won't be able to go through all my scriptures, but I'm going to get to make these points. It's verse 44 says, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as great drops of blood falling to the ground." Here's the Son of God who loved his Father more than any person who ever walked on the face of the earth. You realize what I'm saying here? For 6,000 years now, to this day, no one could ever known the Father more or loved them more than Jesus Christ. He was faced with making decisions. And it was so hard because of his human nature, he had to pray with agony and blood pouring out of his pores to overcome what he had to overcome. Now we're facing, as human beings, fallible, weak, miserable human beings in many cases, having to face and then teach this world what's coming and how to overcome it. And look what Jesus Christ went through to make those decisions. You think it's going to be easy for any of us? If we can't develop the core of the love of God first above all else, I don't care how many points I give you, you're not going to make it. The disciples spent 3.5 years with Christ. They performed miracles. They cast out demons. They were all excited. One time they came back when he sent them out, and they said, "Man, even the demons are subject to us." And Jesus said, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Trying to put him back into perspective. He said, it wasn't what you're doing, it's what you are that makes the difference. And here we're talking about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who knew what he was, who was the creator, who was from the beginning to everlasting, who knew was with the Father, and he struggled with blood to overcome human nature. Brethren, you and I have to reach the love of God in a manner that we have not recognized. It has to reach us so that it's so important to us that no one can do anything to us. And that your love will abound. And through that love, it will help others. Then it doesn't become about you. It becomes about the Father. And that's what we have to go through. The book of Job. Let's go to the book of Job. Shows something that stands out in my mind now, especially since we're doing these video programming, is that I realized when we start doing those videos, I don't know if you realize this or not, and I really hope, and whoever gets this tape, but I'm talking to New Orleans especially, I hope you'll come here early on Sabbaths. I hope that those of you who have a computer, will take time out of your busy lives and work on building PowerPoint presentations to explain the Bible. Do you realize something? That when you start putting in video, things come to mind and questions that you never asked before. I realize when I put together a sermon that I'm using the PowerPoint presentation or I use a video, I have to think beyond the pages of this Bible. I have to actually get into the scriptures. And I have to say, well, what is going on here? How do I explain that? How do I make that real today? And it's not as easy as you think. It takes time. And I want to see all of God's people all over the country pulling together on Sabbath days or in the middle of the week, putting their heads together. And the older people are going to say, oh, I don't know nothing about a computer. Well, that's okay. The younger people might. But you have the knowledge to be able to express to them what God's trying to say. And we pull families and people together, and we build something that we can share with someone else. Somebody told me when I was in Springfield, I won't mention his name here, I'm going to use it later in another sermon. He says, you know, Tom, it dawned on me one day. He said, well, I'm trying to work on doing some of this. He says, you know, imagine if somebody came to me 200 years into the millennium and taps me on my shoulder and say, hey, you know the reason why I'm here in the kingdom? Understood Christ saved him first. Don't get me wrong there. He says, because I saw that video you made, those PowerPoints, and it drew home something I've been overcoming and made it real to me, and I realized that I needed to do this, and because God used you, I'm in the kingdom today. He said, man, when I thought about that, he said, I got chills. He said, I got a chance to help somebody into the kingdom. You know, I never quite put it that simply. Isn't that powerful? I mean, years ago when you were in a church, it was somebody else did the work of God. And I'm showing you, and I'm telling you now, is that God has given us a way that every man, woman, and child in this church can be a part of the work of God. I don't care where you live. You can be a part. Take the time to be a part. Don't sit out there on your own saying, I can't do nothing. You have talent. You wouldn't be here if God didn't give you talent. Now, Job says in the book, in the 42nd chapter of Job, in verse 1, Job says, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do anything, and that there's no thought that can be withheld from you. Who is he who denied counsel without knowledge? Wherefore have I... Now I want you to understand that this is the way we were pre-Katrina, pre-knowledge, pre-Bible, pre-calling. We all knew of God. From the time we were born and we were little, if you lived in the U.S., you heard about God. In many cases, you probably went to church with your parents. So you knew of God. And Job's saying, now we spent 41 chapters going through all of what he did, arguing the points about God. Now Job says, therefore have I uttered which I understood not. And I'm telling you, when I get into these videos and these PowerPoints, there's many things in the Bible that I think I know. When I can't put them in print and visualize, I don't know it yet. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you can't explain to someone that Bible so they can see it with their mind, you don't know it well enough yet. Now that puts every one of us on the spot. Every one of us here, including me. Because when I get into these things, I'm going like, man, how do I describe that? Well, God never had any problem describing it to Job. Paul, he didn't have any problem describing it to Paul in the New Testament, or to Job, or to any of the prophets. When they saw it, they were chilled to their bones what they saw. It scared them half to death. Well, some of these things that we're going to have to do. So he says, he thought he knew it. He says, things that were too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Here I beseech you, and I will speak, and I will demand of you, declare you unto me. God's commands. He says, he goes, and then Job says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear. And all of us have heard about God by the hearing of the ear. We've been to church, and we've been taught year after year. He said, but now my eye sees you. Now this is the point that I was trying to make with the presentations. God is blessing this work, that we have the opportunity to share with the world what God has allowed us to see. How important is that? We can't do that if we can't get past the why. Why do we do it? How do we get ready for what's coming? You have to love God with all your soul, with all your power, and with all your might. Sounds simple, huh? But it really isn't. You have to take the time to go to God. Now, I don't have a lot of time here, but let me just give you some Psalms to go look at, to think about. I'm going to go to Psalms, chapter 1. Chapter 1. Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scorners, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. Obedience, remember? Obedience first. In his law does he meditate day and night. Do you realize those laws were there to protect us? That's what they're there for. They're there to protect you, to help give you eternal life. And yet we don't live up to them. Jesus Christ lived up to them and overcame this world. Like speeding. It tells you don't go past 55 miles an hour. There's a reason for it. You know, or 30 on a highway. They're trying to keep things where it's safe for everybody. Psalm 19, verse 14 is another important on meditation. Psalm 39, verses 1 through 5. Psalm 63, 1 through 6. And I was going to read the 139th Psalm, but of course I don't have time for that today. But it's talking about how David asked God to search his heart and find out if there's anything wrong with him. God has to become real for you and I. Now, I want to close with the scripture that you would never think is associated with this subject matter. It's in the book of Malachi. Let's go to Malachi, chapter, I think I didn't even write it down. All right, I know where it's at, though. It's in Malachi, chapter 3. And they, chapter 3, verse 16, and they that feared the Lord spoke often one to another. All right? Part of the key is going to be speaking with God's brethren. There's 24 hours in a day. All right? Write this down. There'll be a test right after this. Notice the test. 1,440 minutes in a day. 1,440 minutes in a day. 10,080 minutes in a week. 10,080 minutes in a week. How many minutes did you spend speaking to the brethren this past week? Just minutes. Out of 10,000 of them, God says, they that feared God spoke often one to another. How often did you speak to those that feared God last week? Now, your mates don't count. They do count, but you know what I mean. That's too convenient. That's too convenient. You say, well, I send a bunch of emails out. Well, that don't count. It might count, I don't know. But it don't count. And I love what God says here. They spoke often one to another. And the Lord, do you remember the telephone, it used to be called the party line? Did you realize when you're speaking to the brethren, there's a party line? Look what it says. And they feared the Lord spoke often one to another, and the Lord hearkened. See, he's in on that conversation, whether you realized it or not. Remember, wherever two or more gathered, so there I'll be. God's in that conversation. He's on the party line with you. God hearkened, and he heard it. Now, how was that conversation? Did you hear about so-and-so, what they did at church last week? Well, let me tell you about it. You got a party line going, don't forget. Whenever you speak to the brethren, there's a party line out there. God's listening in. Either that or the Bible's lying to you. Now, I hope that shakes you up, because that sure shook me up when I said, whoa, wait a minute. And a book of remembrance was written. Everything you said was written down. That's kind of frightening too, huh? Of course, the New Testament says, therefore, what kind of conduct shall we be in? Well, I think we all understand that. Book of was written before them that feared the Lord and that thought upon his name. I've heard sermons on meditation. How do you meditate? It gives me step 1, step 2, step 3. If I had to go take a test, and every time I had these 7 steps, and you know, you go back and look at my notes, usually there's 7 steps, and prayer's usually the last one. I always feel miserable because I go back and I just can't live up to those steps. I don't think God wants you to live up to steps. You know what I think he wants? I think he wants you. He wants you first with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. If we can't do that, I don't care how many sermons I give you, with as many steps as they got. We're not going to make it past the tribulation. Now, like I said, I don't think that this sermon was going to be the answer for all, but I hope I pointed you in the right direction. The point is, get to know God and His Son, Jesus Christ.